One night, a young king left his palace without a word. He left behind his crown and stepped into the forest. No one dared enter, because in his dreams, someone had always been waiting. A stranger, a creature guarding the valley where old dreams go to die. A single flower that could restore the soul, and a choice that would decide whether he became immortal or finally became real. This is not just a story to listen to. It's a story to feel. In a land where twilight lingered longer than dawn, nestled between whispering forests and sleeping rivers, lay the kingdom of Avalon. Its towers shimmered under moonlight like frozen prayers. And at the center of this dreaming world sat a young ruler named Alaric, upon what poets called the throne of echoes. Alaric was not a tyrant nor a saint. He was searching. He had taken the crown as a boy, wrapped in grief. His mother, Queen Evelyn, vanished one frost-heavy night. His father, King Thorn, followed not long after, undone by sorrow. Now 23, Alaric ruled, but he did not live. By day, his voice echoed in the marble halls. By night, he wandered alone. He wore no cloak, but shadow, no crown, but memory. His counselors feared him too young, too strange. His people respected him too silent, too kind. The city's grandmothers whispered of him as the king who dreams instead of sleeps. And indeed, each night he dreamed the same dream, a silver river under stars, a forest that pulsed with heartbeat, and beside him, always beside him, a man whose face he could never see, but whose presence felt more familiar than his own name. Each morning, Alaric awoke with salt on his cheeks, not fear, but longing. Then one morning, a rumor drifted into Avalon like a forgotten lullaby. A wild man lived in the southern forests, it said. He ran with wolves, drank from streams, touched trees, like they were old friends. Some called him Meh, others a prophet. It was said his eyes glowed like sunlit amber, and that he knew the names of stars that had no place in the sky. Alaric said nothing, but that night he left his palace alone. No guards, no trumpets, just the wind, the silence, and something pulling at his chest like thread. He crossed rivers and meadows, forests thick with moss. For 3 days he searched. On the 4th, he found him. The boy knelt beside a small stream, tending to a wounded fox. He did not turn when Alaric approached. "You're late," he said without bitterness. Alaric stared. "Do I know you?" The man looked up. His eyes held both firelight and distance. "You've dreamed of me. My name is Elias." And Alaric, heart thunderstruck, nodded. For something deep within him whispered, yes. They spoke little that first day. But the silence between them was not empty. It was full of breath, of memory, of something ancient stirring. Elias knew no kings, no palaces, yet his words felt truer than scripture. He spoke of rivers like they were sisters of stars, like they were ancestors. Alaric listened, not as a king, but as someone who had waited a long time to remember who he was. Alaric laughed that night for the first time in years, not the stiff political laugh, but the laugh of a boy who had once climbed trees before the world gave him a crown. When he returned to Avalon, Elias walked beside him. The nobles balked. "Who is this man with no shoes and no title?" They whispered. "Why does he eat with the king?" But the people saw. They saw their king smile in the market. They saw him walk slower, softer. Children ran to Elias without knowing why. Alaric gave no speeches. He simply let Avalon breathe again. The city softened. Merchants lingered to talk. Musicians played without coin. Gardens grew in stone courtyards. Alaric still ruled, yes. But something in him had shifted. He no longer carried the kingdom like a burden. He wore it like a song, and each night he no longer dreamed of a faceless man. He dreamed of Elias and the wild and the warmth. But the world, as it often does, stirred with darker winds. Rumors came from the north. A creature had awoken in the Vale of Thorns, a beast of sorrow and shadow. They said it devoured dreams, that sleep itself refused to enter its domain, that the trees there wept ash. Alaric listened, and he knew what he must do. He stood on the palace balcony one night, gazing at the stars. Elias joined him silently. "I'm going," Alaric said. "To the vale," Elias nodded. "Then I'll walk with you, not to protect, but to remember." And just like that, the king and the wild man turned toward the unknown, not as warriors, not as rulers, but as two souls who understood, sometimes, to face the shadows beyond the world, you must first walk with the one who knows the way back to your heart. The morning of departure arrived as quietly as breath. No trumpets, no ceremony, only the soft gleam of dawn slipping through the mist and the steady footsteps of two men, one a king, the other a stranger, walking into the unknown. Alaric wore a dark wool cloak, thick enough to hold out the chill. Elias, ever unchanged, went barefoot, hair loose, carrying a pouch of herbs and flint. They spoke little, yet their pace was matched, as if their feet remembered a rhythm older than words. The path took them into the northern woodlands, where the sun lingered low, and the trees stood like elders, carved from time. Birds did not sing here. The wind made no sound. Only their steps touched the earth with quiet reverence, like prayer. This road, Elias finally said, after many silent hours, was once walked by dreamers. But they forgot. And when memory fades, dreams die. Alaric nodded, understanding in his bones. Beneath the moss and silence, something was waiting. And each step forward stirred the dust of ancient things. That evening, they made camp by a narrow stream. Alaric lit a fire with the flint Elias handed him. Still learning, still imperfect, but no longer afraid of mistakes. Elias played a reed flute he carried in his satchel, soft, haunting notes that curled through the trees like sighs from the past. Elias Alaric asked, "When the flames were steady, why walk beside me? I am a king. You are free. You owe me nothing." Elias gazed at the fire. "Because you called to me long before you had the words to speak. Because I, too, am searching for myself. And some roads only open when two souls walk them together." Alaric said nothing, but deep within, something softened, like stone cracking to reveal a hidden spring. The next day, they crossed the hill of stillness. Their sound itself seemed to disappear. No birds, no breeze. Even their thoughts felt thin. Elias laid a hand on Alaric's shoulder and whispered, "This is where old dreams were buried. Listen closely. You may hear your own voice from before the crown." Alaric closed his eyes. In the silence, he heard a child's sob. Not laughter, but weeping. Fragile, afraid, alone. And he knew it was him, the boy he had left behind when grief and duty became heavier than hope. As they moved on, Alaric was no longer just a king in search of truth. He was a soul remembering itself. 3 days later, the sky turned gray as ash. They reached the edge of the Vale of Thorns, where the dream-devouring beast was said to dwell. From a distance, the land looked cursed. Trees stood stripped and lifeless. The soil was cracked and cold. The air was thick, like time had stalled and refused to move forward. Elias stopped walking. "From here, I cannot follow. Only your spirit can pass through those gates." Fear stirred in Alaric like a storm, but something stronger stood beside it, the quiet clarity of purpose. "You are not alone," Elias said gently. "But sometimes we must walk into the dark to reclaim the pieces of ourselves we abandoned." And so Alaric entered. The gateway opened like an old wound. No roar, no thunder. Just a sensation of being seen. Utterly, painfully seen. As if the earth itself whispered, "Are you ready?" Alaric's heartbeat pounded. Still, he stepped forward, deeper, into the veil, into the mist that clung to his ankles like memory. There, in the shadowed haze, stood the beast. It was not a dragon, not a demon. It was a towering figure made of sorrow, regret, and ash. Its eyes thus held every dream ever cast aside, and in their depths Alaric saw himself. He did not draw a sword. Instead, he placed a hand upon his chest. "I've been running from myself for too long," he said, voice trembling but clear. "I didn't come to conquer. I came to remember and to forgive." The creature did not roar. It bowed. A soft wind stirred. The mist unraveled. And for the first time, Alaric understood dreams are not won by battle. They are restored by the courage to return. The air was still. As Alaric stood within the heart of the veil, time unraveled. The mist thinned like ancient parchment torn by light. The dream beast, once towering and terrible, now watched him in silence, no longer as a predator, but as a mirror, a monument to sorrow, a guardian of what had been buried too long. And inside that hush, Alaric heard something unexpected. His own heartbeat, soft, steady, mortal. He stepped closer, not out of bravery, but recognition. The beast, stitched together from grief and forgottenness, was made of his broken memories. Every fear he'd exiled, every hope he'd mourned, every version of himself he'd tried to silence, to survive. It did not speak, but it understood. So he sat upon a stone, smoothed by years of wind. Alaric placed his hands in his lap and closed his eyes. Around him, the veil shifted, not with violence, but with memory. He felt it blooming sorrow, not as punishment, but as invitation. Each tree, leafless and gray, began to tremble softly, as if exhaling at last. In his mind, doors opened. He saw himself at 10, hiding behind columns during royal processions, overwhelmed by eyes that demanded strength before he understood the word. He saw himself at 12, holding back tears at his mother's empty bed. At 15, placing a crown upon his head, with hands that still shook from loss. And at 16, already forgetting how to smile. "I see you," Alaric whispered, not to the beast, but to those shadows of himself. "And I'm sorry I left you behind." And then something happened. The beast began to glow, not brightly, not violently, but softly, like the last ember of a hearth still warm before morning. It crouched down beside him, eyes level with his. And in those ancient, quiet eyes, he saw a child alone, aching, waiting, his own soul, and he wept. Back at the mouth of the vale, Elias sat cross-legged beside the cold ashes of their last fire. His eyes were closed, but his heart was listening. He did not worry. He did not pray. He simply waited, like the forest itself, rooted in trust. He knew the path through the veil was not about defeating darkness. It was about embracing it without fear. Time passed strangely inside the wounded land. Perhaps hours, perhaps lifetimes. When Alaric finally rose, the beast did not vanish. It bowed. It stepped backward into the mist, becoming part of the land once more, no longer a threat, but a keeper. The trees around him sighed. Buds of green appeared on brittle branches. A single flower, pale blue, bloomed where ashes once lay. Alaric took it gently, not as a trophy, but as a promise. And when he stepped out of the veil, the first bird in days broke into song. Elias opened his eyes. Alaric was different, not older, not larger, but lighter, as if something sacred had returned to his chest and settled there like breath. He still wore the same cloak, but now it fluttered with grace, not burden. "You remembered," Elias said. "I forgave," Alaric replied. They said nothing more. Some truths do not need words. They live in the space between silence and knowing. They walked back in the direction of Avalon, not as king and companion, but as two men who had walked into death's shadow and found instead a blooming tree. That night, they camped by a mirror lake. Stars shimmered above, and in the water, their reflections danced like ancient spirits. Alaric sat beside Elias and whispered, "When I was young, I thought being king meant being invincible." And now Elias asked. Alaric smiled, soft and sure. "Now I know. It means being honest, especially when you're not." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that rises from peace, not performance. And in that moment, under the starlight and pine, a friendship sealed itself, not with vows, but with shared stillness. Far away in Avalon, something changed. The people didn't know why, but the wind smelled different, softer. The stone walls no longer felt cold. Children dreamed of trees instead of fire. And the palace cats, long known for avoiding the throne room, curled up beside the dais for the first time in years. Some said the king was returning soon. Others said he had already begun. The journey home should have brought peace. But something inside Alaric had shifted, and not all of it was soothing. Though the veil no longer haunted him, and though the beast had returned to ash, a new silence followed him. Not the silence of fear, but of absence. Because Elias, the one who had walked beside him from the start, was no longer at his side. They had parted ways at the edge of the silver forest. Elias had said only, "You must go alone from here. What you're seeking next is not something I can help you find." Alaric had nodded, not because he understood, but because he trusted. In Avalon, the king returned to celebration. Bells rang. Feasts lit fire across the capital. Flowers were strewn on the marble steps of the palace. But none of it reached Alaric's core. He smiled. He blessed. He spoke. But at night, in the solitude of his chambers, something new kept him awake. Not fear, not grief, but a question. Was it enough? He had faced the beast. He had faced himself. But the ache remained. The same ache that haunted his childhood dreams. The ache of impermanence. One night, staring at the stars from his balcony, he whispered, "What if I still lose everything?" The next day, he summoned the oldest archivist in Avalon, an ancient woman named Maera, who remembered stories older than stone. Her eyes were clouded by age, but bright with wisdom. "I need to know," he said softly. "If there's a way, not to die." Maera tilted her head. "Not to die, Your Grace. Not just my body," Alaric clarified, "but memory, meaning. What if my soul fades? What if all I've become disappears when I do?" She was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into her robes and produced a worn scroll. "There is one story," she said, "older than the throne you sit on." That night, Alaric read of a man called Thalos, an ancestor long lost to time. Thalos had sought out the Ancient One, a being who had survived the Great Flood, and had been gifted the secret of enduring life. The secret, it was said, was guarded far beyond the lands of men across Death's River, past the sea that forgot on an island where time curled in on itself. There, a flower bloomed only once every century. It held not immortality, but restoration, not eternal life, but a return to the youth of the soul. Alaric made his decision before the ink on the scroll dried. He left Avalon before the second dawn bell. Only Maera knew where he had gone, and she told no one. He traveled through frost-bitten passes and sunlit plains. He crossed rivers that sang old lullabies. He slept beneath trees whose names he whispered in thanks. And at last, he reached the sea of memory. A fisherman at the edge of the waters took him across. No coin, just silence, exchanged for silence. Days passed, waves fell behind them, like soft applause. Then at twilight, on the 6th day, the island appeared, not with glory, but like a sigh. The island was quiet, no beasts, no birds, only stillness. Alaric walked until his legs ached. Then, just as he reached a clearing near the island's center, he saw it, the flower. It grew from a blackened patch of earth surrounded by ash, but it pulsed, alive. It was silver, violet, and blue all at once, shifting like breath. And as he drew near, he felt younger, not in body, but in wonder. Like the boy who once watched lightning and thought it was magic. He knelt, touched the stem, and just before he could pluck it, a whisper rose, not from the wind, but from within. "If you take me," it said, "you may forget what made you seek me." Alaric froze. The flower shimmered in his palm. "What do you mean?" "To return to innocence," it breathed, "is to let go of pain. But pain taught you how to love. Are you ready to lose that?" Alaric closed his eyes. He remembered Elias's voice, the child's sob in the veil, the ache of standing before the beast and whispering, "I'm sorry." Was he truly willing to let all of that fade, just to feel whole again? Slowly, gently, he placed the flower back and stood. He left the island with empty hands but a full heart. Somewhere beneath the ashes of the world, a flower still bloomed. He would let it bloom for someone else. He would carry the ache, because within it lived all the reasons he'd ever dared to dream. The shore of the mainland welcomed Alaric with gentle rain, not a storm, not thunder, but a soft mist that kissed his shoulders and hair, like the sky itself was grateful he had come back. He stepped off the fisherman's boat in silence. No words had passed between them in the entire journey back, and none were needed. The old man gave Alaric a nod, then disappeared into the fog as if he had never existed, just a guide for a soul who needed reminding. Alaric looked around. No celebration, no fanfare, just earth, wind, rain, and it was perfect. He made his way through old paths and familiar hills. But something had changed, not in the land, but in him. The trees looked taller now, not intimidating, but noble. The rivers sounded deeper, not because of volume, but meaning. The world had not shifted, but he had. When Alaric reached Avalon, the guards at the eastern gate did not recognize him at first. He was cloaked in travel, dust eyes, quiet, smile, worn gently like an old tune. But the moment he spoke, just a soft, "I'm home," they fell silent and let him through. Inside the city, life bustled as always. Vendors called out to passing children. Bells rang in the temples. Bakers placed loaves on windowsills like gifts for the wind. But as Alaric walked through, people began to pause. There was no royal cloak, no parade, just a man, but one who felt whole. Back at the palace, old Myra waited. She knew somehow. Knew he would not bring back the flower. Knew he had left it untouched, blooming beneath the ashes. She bowed deeply, but with a smile. "You did not choose eternity," she said. "I chose to feel," Alaric replied. She nodded, her eyes shining. Then Avalon has a king again. That night, Alaric sat beneath the palace's oldest tree, a great willow whose roots curved like questions and whose leaves whispered like memory. He closed his eyes and waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but something inside him said, "Be still, be still, and something will return." And return it did, a familiar presence, footsteps soft as dusk. When he opened his eyes, Elias stood there. He hadn't aged a day, but his eyes had changed deeper, warmer, touched by distance, but still tethered by memory. "You found it," Elias said. "I did, and you let it go." "I had to." Elias sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "You know," Elias said, "eventually, many kings would have taken it." "I know. You would have been praised, immortalized, turned into legend." "I didn't want to be a legend," Alaric whispered. "I wanted to be real." Elias smiled. "And so you are." From that night on, Avalon changed in quiet ways. Laws became gentler. The palace held open days where no titles mattered. Poetry returned to the schoolyards. Children were invited to ask questions in the royal court, and the people noticed. They noticed not a new king, but a new kind of king, one who had walked through shadow and returned not with power, but peace. In the months that followed, Alaric would still walk the gardens at dusk, sometimes alone, sometimes with Elias, and sometimes with a small group of children who followed him like little stars, asking him stories of distant lands, rivers that sang, and a flower that could make you young again. He always told them the same thing. Being young is not about age. It's about how open your heart still is to wonder. One day, as spring began to breathe through the city, Alaric passed a street artist painting a mural. He paused. The artist had painted a beast massive, made of ash and smoke. But in its eyes, she had drawn sorrow, not rage. And across from it stood a boy, not a warrior, not a king, but a boy holding out his hand. "Did you know?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "They say, this story is real." Alaric smiled and said nothing. He simply placed a silver coin in her basket and walked on, heart full. Spring unfolded gently in Avalon. The city awoke, not with noise, but with breath. Flowers returned to windowsills. Bees hummed like quiet songs. And in the palace garden, where stone once ruled, vines curled over marble, claiming it not as conquest, but as belonging. Alaric spent long mornings walking barefoot through dew-kissed courtyards. His crown now rested in a velvet box, not discarded, simply resting. He ruled by presence, not proclamation. People noticed, and perhaps more importantly, they softened. But one night, as moonlight danced along the rivers, Alaric felt a tug, a knowing, a whisper in his soul. It said, "Go to the water." He followed it, down the stone steps, through the sleeping city, past ivy walls and rusted gates, until he stood alone beside the river Ellen, which had wrapped Avalon like a silver thread for generations. The water shimmered with stillness. He knelt at its edge and listened. The voice did not thunder. It hummed. It hummed like old lullabies sung before memory. Then it spoke not to his ears, but to his marrow. "You have walked far, Alaric." He said nothing aloud, but the river heard his heart. "I don't know what's next," he thought. "I've faced the shadow. I've left the flower. I've returned. But still, I wait for something." The river rippled. "Then you are ready. For what? To remember what was never taught, but always known." Suddenly, the stars above shifted, or perhaps he did, because in the river, he saw not his reflection, but memories, visions. He saw his mother, laughing strong alive. He saw his father, gentle bending to tie his shoe before court. He saw Elias standing silently in the forest years before they met. And then he saw something else, a garden, but not of earth, a garden of light, of souls, blooming and luminous. Each flower held a name, each name a story, and one glowed brighter than the rest. His. The river whispered, "You were not born to be eternal. You were born to remember what eternity feels like." So even in a single breath, tears touched Alaric's cheeks, not of sorrow, but of recognition. It wasn't about conquering death. It was about tasting life so fully that even death would sing your name softly. When he opened his eyes, dawn had begun to color the sky. Birdsong returned to the city, as if timed to the beat of his heart. And when he stood, he did not feel older, nor younger. He simply felt right. That morning, he gathered the people of Avalon. No throne, no armor, just presence. He stood in the city square, sunlight crowning his shoulders. He spoke, "My people, I have no decree. Only this, there is a river within each of you. It remembers when you laugh, when you break, when you love. Drink from it, even if your hands shake, especially if they do." The people did not cheer. They wept, not from sadness, but relief. For too long they had carried burdens mistaken for strength, and now they were allowed to feel again. That night, Elias found him under the starlit fig tree. "You heard it," he said simply. "The river, no." Elias smiled. "Your soul." Alaric smiled back. "I thought it would roar. It never needs to. It's been whispering your name since the beginning. You just needed to be still long enough to hear it." And so Avalon entered an age not of glory, but of gentleness. And gentleness, as it turns out, was the greatest legacy of all. Years passed in the rhythm of seasons. Avalon no longer followed the heartbeat of war or power, but of music gardens and dreams. And at the center of it all was a man named Alaric, who had once been a king, but now was something quieter, something deeper. He no longer sat on the throne each morning. He walked the city instead, not to rule, but to remember. The children of Avalon loved him most. They followed him through the orchards and markets, not because of what he carried, but because of what he didn't. He didn't carry fear or pride, or the heavy armor of command. He carried stories and silence, and they listened to both like sacred gifts every full moon. Alaric gathered the townsfolk under the fig tree on the eastern hill. He brought no scrolls, no plans, just his voice, soft and slow, and he would speak. Once I met a wild man who didn't bow. Once I faced a beast made of sorrow. Once I found a flower that could erase pain. And I left it blooming, because some pain is holy. It teaches you how to stay. People cried sometimes during his stories, but more often, they simply leaned closer, because in a world of loudness, the quietest truths echo the longest. One evening, as the wind turned golden with autumn, Elias came to him beneath the tree. He looked older now, not in body, but in gaze, like he had seen more than even time could record. It's almost time, Elias said. For what? For the last silence. Alaric nodded, not in fear, but in reverence. That night, he walked through Avalon slowly, his hands brushing stone walls, his eyes memorizing rooftops, his heart capturing the laughter that drifted from open windows. He didn't say goodbye. He simply gave presence to everything. He returned to the palace, not as a ruler, but as a witness. He walked to the mirror in his chamber and looked at his reflection, not to check age, but to see if the boy who once wept under stars still lived behind his eyes. He did, and he smiled. At dawn, Alaric climbed the western tower. The city below shimmered in sleep. The mountains beyond whispered like guardians, and the wind kissed his hair like a blessing. Elias stood waiting at the top. No words were exchanged. They simply sat and watched and listened. The silence was not empty. It was filled with everything they had lived: the journey, the loss, the learning, the love, and the letting go. When the sun crested the edge of the world, Alaric turned to Elias and said, "I'm ready." Elias nodded and touched his shoulder gently. Then Alaric closed his eyes and became the silence itself. Not vanished, not lost, just returned to the place that remembers all things. Down in Avalon, the bells did not toll. Instead, children woke with laughter. Winds carried songs that had no source, and a fig tree on the eastern hill bloomed overnight, its branches stretching toward heaven, its roots singing under the soil. The fig tree bloomed for 3 days and 3 nights. Its blossoms fell like snow, soft and slow, blanketing the hill with silver petals. No one touched them. No one swept them away. It was as if the land itself held its breath, honoring something sacred that had passed quietly through it. Alaric was gone, but no one said the word death. They said he returned to the dream, and somehow everyone understood. Children continued to climb the stone steps of the palace. They still played among the fountains and curled up beneath the willow tree. But now they spoke softly of the man who listened, the king who didn't conquer, the voice who carried silence. And in the evenings, old Elias would sit by the riverbank where Alaric once knelt. He would watch the current. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he sang, but most of the time he simply remembered. He remembered the first time he saw the boy with tearful eyes in a forest glade. He remembered the veil and the beast and the bloom that was left untouched. And he remembered a voice saying, "I want to be real, not legendary." And so he was. Years passed, then decades, and Avalon changed. New kings were crowned, New seasons came and went, but one thing never changed. The fig tree, it still bloomed every year on the very same night, petals falling in silence, and no one ever dared pick a single one. One day, a young girl named Lyra climbed the hill alone. She was curious. She was quiet. And she had always felt different. She didn't know why the tree pulled at her heart. She only knew it did. She knelt beneath its branches and whispered, "Who are you?" And though no voice answered aloud, she heard something deep within. "You are the one who listens." And she wept, but not from sadness, from remembering. That evening, she went to the town square. She stood on the old stone bench and began to tell a story. It wasn't written, it wasn't planned, it simply came of a boy who dreamed of someone he couldn't name, of a wild man in the woods, of a journey to face the shadow, of a flower left untouched, of a return not as hero, but as heart, of a king who ruled by presence and who became the silence that teaches. The crowd listened, not because the tale was grand, but because it was true. Even those who had never heard of Alaric felt like they had always known him, because something in them, in all of us, longs for gentleness that doesn't demand, truth that doesn't shout, and love that doesn't need to be explained. That night, Lyra walked to the fig tree once more, and in the hush of starlight, she whispered, "Thank you for dreaming me into this world." And the wind answered, in leaves, in petals, in song. And so the dream continued, passed not through bloodlines, but through stories, through quiet hearts, through every soul who dares to feel and chooses not to forget. Dreams of Avalon was never about a throne. It was about the boy who asked questions, the man who listened, and the silence that remains, not as an ending, but as an invitation. Some stories don't end with a conclusion, but with a breath, quiet and complete. Alaric did not choose to become a legend. He chose to become real. And in silence, he left behind something that remains. A dream that knows how to listen. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If something in your heart was stirred, hold it. Don't forget it. And if you'd like to explore more dreams like this one, stay with us. This channel is for the quiet ones, the deep feelers, just like you.